for grammar and spelling. That's a legitimate tool, and that can be mentioned in the methods. Like, that's a legitimate tool, so it can be used as a replacement, let's say, for a medical editor. So, but I would really strongly advise people not to use AI tools to actually write the paper itself. There's a very high risk there that one could run into plagiarism issues and inaccuracy issues.
Okay, shall we move on, please?
As the segue, Michael was just speaking. So Michael Fehlings is the next speaker who's going to talk about result in manuscript writing.
Thank you. And I'm traveling, so I prepared a video. I'm here, so let's see if the video works, if we can play that. If there's a technical challenge, I'll share my screen.
Hello, I'm Michael Fehlings from the University of Toronto, and it's a pleasure to take part in this WFNS symposium on scientific writing. And I'm going to be discussing the results in manuscript writing and really kind of focusing on the pearls and pitfalls of scientific writing. I have no specific commercial disclosures. I have a regenerative medicine biotechnology startup that I run at arm's length, and I am on the editorial board of several basic science and clinical journals, and am editor-in-chief of Spinal Cord, which is one of the Nature publications. So I'd like to acknowledge a number of people, including Professor Salman Sharif, who's the coordinator of the WFNS committee activities, and I wanted to thank and acknowledge my two co-moderators, Drs. Hamden and Steinmetz. So in terms of the objectives of this lecture, I'm going to discuss the approach to writing a paper, including some brief comments on various types of papers that you may wish to consider putting together. I'll present the Equator Network guidelines on how to present a report, and then I give a few pearls on how to choose a journal, and then how to handle rejections or requests or revisions. Then I'll discuss some common pitfalls and end with some pearls. So in terms of laying out the paper, so the paper typically has an abstract, introduction, methods, results, and discussion. In an abstract, often the use of a structured abstract with distinct subheadings can be an effective approach. It depends on the journal guidelines, but it is critical to summarize the key points: the rationale, background, the question, hypothesis, the methods, key results, and main results and conclusions. Now, the introduction is distinct from the discussion, and sometimes I see people mixing the two of these up. In the introduction, it's important to cite just enough literature to frame the question, but it's critical that you state the research question or hypothesis clearly. Then in the methods, it's important to provide all the key details in the subjects, outcome measures, controls, the length and completeness of follow-up. In the results, here it's important to make effective use of tables and figures, as this can summarize information effectively. In the discussion, this is often one of the hardest parts of the paper to write. The opening paragraph, I would recommend that you summarize the key results. And then subsequent to this, you should discuss 4 or 5 key points, and each point will be a separate a paragraph. And then depending on the formatting of the journal, sometimes one can use subject matter headings. It's important to discuss the literature that agrees with your findings, but especially any literature that may not entirely agree with your findings, and it's important to discuss this. Now, for a technical report, a case report, this really should be unique and provide novel insights on treatment strategy. It's very helpful if this is very well illustrated, and you should really try to avoid publishing cases that only marginally add to the literature. Now, case series is the most common type of surgical paper that we see, and the keys to success are if this can be prospective, and I recognize that this may not always be possible. You should try for a minimum of 1-year follow-up. In many of the journals, particularly if you're looking to require it, if possible, use validated outcome measures. Try to have a high rate of follow-up, at least 80%. clearly document the clinical and radiological outcomes, have a clear documentation of complications, and if possible, include a control group so that you're actually comparing outcomes. Now, for basic science or papers or experimental reports, the keys to success, having a clear testable hypothesis that has of a clinical or basic science significance. And there's a magic 5-figure rule. You should have enough data that you have 5 key figures to present. The quantitation of results is extremely important, and the quality of the images is a critical point. Now, I want to share with you an important development related to reporting guidelines to facilitate the publication of papers. And this is summarized through an online service called the Equator Network. And this is the website information for this. And the Equator Network provides you with a very easy to access set of guidelines on how to report papers. So, for example, for randomized trial, the famous CONSORT guidelines; for observational studies, the STROBE guidelines; for systematic reviews, the PRISMA guidelines, and so on and so forth. Even case reports have particular guidelines, and these are called the CARE guidelines. And this is summarized here. So this is actually a checklist of information that you should include when writing a case report. And this is summarized here. So it gives specific information on what you should include in the abstract, critical information related to the introduction, patient information, clinical findings, and so on. So this is very helpful if you're considering writing a case report. Now, another set of guidelines, these are the CONSORT guidelines, and these are the classic guidelines to use when reporting a randomized trial or perhaps a prospective comparative effectiveness study. And this has kind of the classic sections with the title and abstract, introduction methods, and so on, but it goes into very specific details on what one should be presenting. And then in terms of the results, specific data on the participant flow, the recruitment, baseline data, the analysis, the outcomes, adverse events, and so on. And then the discussion. And what's important here is really kind of the interpretation of these data. And this is a key figure. This is typically figure 1 in the presentation of large prospective clinical studies, and this is the so-called CONSORT diagram, where you're looking at the total number of patients that were assessed, and how many were actually enrolled or randomized into the study, and what were the arms, and then what was the ultimate follow-up, and what was the dropout. Now, how do you choose the most appropriate journal? So one of the techniques that you can use is examine your bibliography. Where were the papers published? This is often a very good place to start in terms of journal selection. And then look at the personality of the journal. What types of papers are listed in the instructions to the authors? What types of papers tend to get published in these types of journals? And then one can, of course, look at the impact factor. One can look at the citation index. But I think it's more important that your paper actually fit the personality of that journal. Now, very commonly, when you're submitting papers, you're asked to provide revisions, and occasionally you need to handle rejection. So rejections are tough. What I do, and I receive these as well, put the letter away for a day or two and come back to it. What can you learn from the reviewer's comments? And try to revise the paper to take advantage of the criticisms received, because more often than not, at least one of the reviewers who had previously seen your paper will be reviewing that paper again when you've resubmitted this. Request for revision. So here, this is very important to differentiate the points that require clarification or discussion versus the points that require additional data analysis or new experiments. The response letter is absolutely key. You should clearly raise each point and summarize the way this has been addressed. And if you disagree with the reviewer, you can rebut the points raised, but it's important that you do that with literature support, and you should be diplomatic in your wording. Common pitfalls: failure to comply with the author's instructions. So look at these very carefully. Typographic or grammatical errors can be a fatal error. So it's very important that you go over this carefully. And if English is not your first language, consider using a medical editor familiar with English. The abstract, you want this to be informative and avoid overstating the results. The introduction, it's commonly too long and then often does not state the key question and why this is important. In the methods, it's very important that you follow the guidelines, and the Equator network is extremely helpful here. So subject selection, length and nature of follow-up, outcomes assessments. And then the results. Try to make effective use of tables and figures and avoid having tables and figures that duplicate the same data. And a common error is when the discussion is too long and it's unfocused. So think about 4 or 5 points that you're going to discuss, with the opening paragraph representing a summary of the key findings, and the concluding paragraph summarizing everything and then pointing out the next steps. So key pearls. Again, follow the guidelines outlined in the Equator network. Very helpful. I always write the methods in the results sections first. These are the most straightforward to put out. The introduction. I include only enough literature to establish why the question being asked is an important one. Frame the question or hypothesis and make it interesting and relevant.
I think
Sounds like there might be some audio issues there, but I think we can probably stop the presentation here.
Read the paper and to critique this.
So, Michael, there is a question in the chat that says, how important is language polish and professional editing in international journal acceptance? Is it mandatory?
Well, I would say that a clearly written paper is important, and I reckon it's difficult even for people who have English as a first language to write clearly. It's an art, for sure. I think that if English is not a first language, it can be helpful to have an English-speaking colleague or even a medical editor review this. And as I've indicated, one can use certain AI tools in a medical editing sense to correct, to correct grammar, syntax, and flow. It's important to avoid grammatical errors and spelling errors. So it is very important for sure.
I mean, people are judged against the same standard that an English-speaking writer is doing.
Yes, that's correct.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Hey, Michael, how are you? Good to see you.
Good to see you, Roger.
Good. I had a question related to the previous presentation, but also related to your presentation, of course. Let's say, I'm not that familiar with AI, but I noticed, like, if you, let's say you have to write a paper about complications of a particular operation, right? Or book chapter.
Yes.
And you put that into AI and you say, list me the most common complications of this procedure and give me some details about that. And it spits out like this whole list of complications. Is that, at what point does this become then, and you use that then to write your book chapter, but you rephrase it. But at what point does it become illegitimate? Or at what point does it become plagiarism or questionable? And at what point is it actually a helpful tool? Because it is somewhat helpful, right? I mean, it gives you some, maybe you would have forgotten some of the complications otherwise. So
yeah, I think
it's a gray zone, I guess.
Yeah, Roger, I think the way you're describing the use of of AI is as a search engine and as a tool, and it's in a sense, it's very similar to Google Analytics, right? Which also employs AI. And so I think if you're using this as a search engine to assist you with a literature review, but then you're taking that information and you're phrasing that with your own language and putting it together, I think that's entirely valid. I have no problem with that at all. You're using that as a tool. So to me, that's similar to doing a PubMed search or doing Google Analytics, or and so on. I think what's important to recognize is that most AI tools, including ChatGPT, are dependent on the quality of the informational literature. So if you are searching a topic and you have a very precise question and there's a very extensive validated literature, you're going to get a quite a sensible response. But if you don't word the question correctly, or if the literature maybe is a lot of gray literature, so for example, a lot of people's websites where they're making various outlandish claims on their websites, that can also appear in a ChatGPT search. And so one needs to be very careful around this. And so one always needs to look at this. And I think the previous speaker emphasized the importance of a human being critically analyzing this. Okay. And so again, I would really caution against just putting in, write me a book chapter on topic X and out something spits. I think that is very concerning from an ethical perspective, firstly, but also it can often spit out information that's incorrect. But what you described, the use of as a search engine, as a tool, is entirely valid. And I think that's actually a very correct way to use that as a tool. And similarly, the use of AI medical editing tools to polish the language, to check for syntax and grammar, that there's absolutely no problem with that. That's absolutely fine.
Thank you. Sounds reasonable.
I think